Hey my good people, thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2011 Porsche 911 Carrera S. Today on the 911 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace the water pump and thermostat. Now typically Porsche recommends you replace this every 48 to 60,000 miles or every 45 years. In the example behind us, that car has 65,000 miles. It has the original pump and thermostat, and it is 10 years old. So it's definitely due for this job before anything goes awry. A couple things to note. Usually when you have a failing water pump, you're going to see or hear either a bad noise or your weeping hole is going to start to get a little moist or leak if it's worse than expected. Our kit that we sell on the site includes everything needed for this job. You have your gallon of concentrated coolant, your new water pump with a metal impeller, you have a new thermostat with accompanying seals and hardware, as well as a new water pump pulley. Now to my right, you're going to see we have some hardware here. This was a New England car, so most of the hardware, exhaust, nuts and bolts are all corroded. So we're going to go ahead and replace as much as we can, as it does have to come off for this job. So before we get started with all this, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this job, we have a different set of tools needed for the water pump and thermostat replacement, starting with a hammer, two different torque spec torque ratchets. These are both 3/8. We have a 3/8 regular ratchet, a 1/4 inch drive ratchet, a couple different extensions for both. We have sockets all the way from 10 millimeter all the way to 16 in different lengths. We have deep, shallow, and extended. We also have a swivel socket extension, a T55, a T40, and an 8 millimeter hex, as well as a 6 millimeter hex, which is not pictured here. We have a wire brush. We have a T25 and a T30, as well as an 8 millimeter ratcheting wrench, a 13 and a 16. In addition to that, we have a flathead screwdriver and then a 19 millimeter for our lug bolts. A couple nice to haves are pry bars, electric ratchets, and electric impacts. Make some of the tougher to get bolts a little bit easier and quicker to come out. Now that we have our tools covered, let's get started on this DIY. Before we get started, we're working on the lift today. We're going to go ahead and remove our wheels on both sides. This is so we have easy access to our bumper hardware, as well as good camera points of views. So, 19 millimeter socket. All right, to get started, we're going to start by removing our expansion tank cap. That way, as we break free our bleeder screws, we can go ahead and let the system flow out gently. You obviously want to make sure this is stone cold before you do this. If you're not sure, you can always release your valve up top to release any pressure. I'm going to set that off. So what you have up here is your pressure relief valve, and sometimes you can use this if you're bleeding the car or trying to burp the system. And the way you use it is you lift it up, and then that'll allow just enough of the pressure buildup to get out should you try to burp the cooling system or get air out of it. Otherwise, you always want to make sure it's flipped down and closed. Now let's go ahead and get the car up in the air and start draining some coolant out. All right, my good people. Next, we're going to work on draining our coolant from the block, starting by removing the drain plug underneath the thermostat. You're going to need a 6 millimeter hex. I'm using a 6 millimeter hex on a 3/8 ratchet. Break that free. Do the rest by hand. Just like when you do an oil change, you can always push up on the drain plug while you unthread it, so that way you have a chance of pulling it out quickly so you don't get covered in coolant or oil. All right, my good people, at this point, this side is basically coming down to a small dribble. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you up top with me while we're working on this and have this drain plug open. And you can either use compressed air or a shop vac, whatever you have available to you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to blow some air through the expansion tank to help push some of the coolant through that may be still stuck in here. And the reason for that is because you want the system as empty as possible. When you use a vacuum fill tool, it's going to suck up all the air out of the system. And if it's sucking up coolant as well, you're going to get a bit of a mess up top. So we're going to push as much out, and you'll see me do this throughout the whole job, starting with this drain plug. I'll do the same thing once we get to the neck here by the water pump. And then once we disconnect our radiators up front, you're going to see the same thing again. So if you see me climbing up top, that's what we're doing. Again, a shop air or compressed air will do just fine. We have shop air here today, so let's get to it. All right, so again, what I'm doing is we have the tank here. I have my shop air. I'm going to put the nozzle in, cover the rest with a towel.
You should be able to see some coolant down there. That should do us for now. We're gonna reinstall our drain plug on the thermostat side and do the same thing next to the water pump neck. At this point, we can go ahead and reinstall our drain plug. I'm gonna get rid of the old crush washer. We have a new one for this, which that will also be linked in the description below. You always want to replace the crush washers when you do this job. Just like an oil drain plug, it'll leak if you don't replace it. And we're just gonna snug it up by hand with the 3/8 ratchet. And then we're gonna snug it up to 30 Newton meters. You can see it's not a lot. You don't have to gorilla it on. Just be gentle with it. All right, we're gonna go ahead and repeat the exact same process on this end. Same thing with the air and everything. And just like we did on the thermostat side, we're gonna go ahead and remove our drain plug over here as well and hit the tank with some compressed air. Again, this is a 6mm hex. With that done, we can go ahead and reinstall our drain plug. Again, new crush washer. Now that we have the rear of the car drained, we're gonna go ahead and work on removing our belly pans down here so we can disconnect our radiator hoses and drain it even further. So T25, you have a couple pieces of hardware all around. Let's get those off. Then we have two 10mm nuts to remove that hold our aluminum pipes in place. All right, let's get our catch pan and work on releasing these two connections. I'm just gonna use a flathead screwdriver to pry up on this clip. You can fully remove it if you want, or set it back like that. Then, depending on how long it has been since this has been off last, or if it's ever been off, the O-ring in here might be pretty glued to the rubber section of this, so you might have to fight it a little bit. Just be prepared for a mess. All right, at this point, I'm gonna head back up top to my expansion tank, and just like I did before, I'm gonna blow some air through the system so we can get as much of the coolant out from the pipes as possible. With this emptied out as much as possible, we're gonna go ahead and reconnect everything. However, if you can, I would recommend replacing this O-ring. We'll leave a link in the description for that part number as well, as it's not part of our kits, but it is something I would recommend you replace. This one's original to the car. I'm sure it's been off in the past, so it'd be a smart move to replace it. The new O-ring on, it's gonna be a little bit of a tighter fit than it was when you took it apart. So you wanna make sure you get it a little bit lubricated with the existing coolant, and then you're just gonna have to massage it back into place so that you can put your metal clip back on. We're gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side. Once we do both of those, we'll put our 10mm bolts back in just so we don't forget them later.
Next, before we continue with anything else, we're gonna work on removing our taillights. To do this water pump and thermostat job, it's easier if you have the bumper cover off and your heat shields. So to get to that point, we're gonna start by removing our taillights. You're gonna need a T25 for that. You have two T25 screws on both sides. You don't have to fully remove them. You just want to back them out a little bit. You'll see the taillight come loose. With them freed up, you can then go ahead and pull the taillight towards you. Just like that. You see the hardware remains with the taillight. And you have one electrical connector here that you want to undo. Now let's do the same on the passenger side. Before we leave this area, the next thing to do is remove these 4 T30 screws. So I'm going to take my T30 on a 1/4" ratchet and just back these out quickly. Now you have a T30 that sits at the corner of the bumper here. This is a plastic one, so it doesn't take a lot of force. Kind of back it out like that. Give it a wiggle, the whole thing comes out. Let's do the same thing on the other side. On either side of the car, you have a T30 hidden up in the wheel well here. So let's go ahead and remove those. Beautiful. Let's do the same thing on the other side. And now all we have left is 6 T30s around the bottom of the bumper. So let's get those off. With all our hardware removed now, the next thing to do is remove the bumper itself. So I'm gonna start on the passenger side. I'm gonna pull the bumper away from its retaining clips. There we go. And now, just gently, I'm gonna start working the bumper back, grabbing it from the bottom and the top here. And then lastly, we have our electrical connector here for our license plate lights. Disconnect that. You can pull the bumper off. With our bumper cover off, the next thing to do is remove the heat shield and bumper support. They're one piece. You have two 16mm bolts on either end. And now you can grab it by the bumper supports here and just pull the whole thing off. Beautiful, baby. All right, my good people, now comes the fun part. We have our heat shield off, we have our exhaust exposed, and the next thing for us is going to be to remove the center section. We have all new clamps, new hardware, mainly due to the fact that this was a New York car for a long time. So all these pieces are corroded, some of them are falling apart. So I'm going to do my best to get them off. I'm going to hit everything with a wire wheel first, just to make life a little bit easier. We've been soaking them with penetrant for the last 24 hours. So you can see they're still pretty wet. So let's do that. Hopefully your hardware looks much better than this, so this will go quicker for you. All right, we're going to start by removing our first 13mm nut. Traditionally, these should all be 13s. As you can see, ours are a little bit worse for wear. You might see me swapping between a 13 and a 12, depending on what fits better. So best case scenario, if they all break like that, I'll make our life a little bit easier. We'll be replacing these studs anyways. So let's try that again. So you can see this one's pretty messed up. Before we even try messing with it and deform what's left of that nut, I'm going to take some MAP gas and just heat it up as best as I can, facing the heat away from the engine and any electrical connectors. So just be mindful of that. Boom, baby. Same thing on the other side. I'm just going to torch these right off the rip so we can have a better chance at taking them off intact. Tap these sockets on. If you're torching at home, just be mindful that the sockets are going to get pretty hot pretty quickly. Next, we're going to try to remove these clamps. I am replacing these, so I'm going to undo both. If you're only removing this, you can get away with just doing the outside one. It's 13mm socket. All right, my good people, we're getting straight to the good stuff. You already know what's happening. This is not going to come off. These clamps are being replaced, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut this one off. We'll free it up, then we'll work on removing this other one, and then we'll try our luck on the other side. As always, when you're working with a cutting wheel, make sure you wear your safety glasses, goggles, whatever you have. All right, now let's work on the other side. We're going to try our luck on this side of the hardware, see if we can get any of it off before taking extreme measures. Same thing, everything's spinning, and there's just nothing left there. Same thing on this side. The hardware's even in worse shape, so we're going to go ahead and cut both of these clamps off carefully, and then we'll proceed on removing the last bit of hardware before we can take the center section out. Now we have our third flange nut left. I'm going to try to get it from up top here with an extension and a swivel. Okay. Let's try it again on the other side. Do it. All right, now with all our hardware removed, the last two things to take off are these straps that hold the center section muffler to the vehicle. You're going to need a 6mm hex. And now with both of those off, we have the task of trying to free up the center section from the rest of the vehicle. So I'm going to separate both of the flanges here first and then work on getting them off these clamps. I'm just going to take a small flathead screwdriver and pry in between the flanges here. Bam, baby. Let's do this water pump. Now, back up top in the engine bay, we're going to go ahead and work on getting this airbox out so we can access the top half of our water pump and thermostat job. To start, we're going to go ahead and remove our mass airflow sensor. You have a connector or a clip on the bottom that you're going to want to push up on. And you'll hear it unclick itself. Just pull it back. Set up to the side. Next, we're going to go ahead and undo the hose clamp that holds the intake boot to the throttle body. Just using a flathead screwdriver to get that off. With that loose, now we're going to go ahead and remove the little solenoid on the right hand side of the airbox. To remove this, you're just going to lift up on the end of the clip here and push it back at the same time, just like that, and then the whole solenoid will free itself from the airbox. And now we can work on pulling the airbox out. To do so, I like to pull back on the intake boot first. Free it up from the throttle body. And then at the same time, you're going to lift up the whole airbox and then rotate it so that the intake boot starts facing you. And then there's a couple vacuum lines underneath that you're going to want to either disconnect or set your box to the side somehow so that you don't have to touch them too much. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to swing it over get this propped up, and then we'll continue with the removal of everything. Before we head underneath the car, we're going to do a couple things up top here. We're going to start by disconnecting this hose from our thermostat housing. Just going to use a flathead screwdriver to undo this hose clamp. All right, we'll battle that hose once we get to that point. Next, I'm going to do this top Torx bolt. I'm using one of these fancy like multi-use wrenches. This is an 8mm. Basically, this does Torx, regular hex. You can see it's got like a funny set of teeth. So this is an 8mm. And then we can just pull it out. With that done, we can go ahead and now work on loosening up our belt tensioner so we can remove our belt. Since we're going to go ahead and remove the whole engine carrier, this would be a good time to replace your belt if your belt's still original on your vehicle, which it is for this car. It's a 30mm wrench. And you go towards the engine itself. It's free from the water pump. That's all we need for now. Let's head underneath the car and continue with this disassembly. At this point, we have our engine supported with a screw jack and a piece of plywood under the sump. Before we go ahead and do anything else, we're going to get the 16mm bolt that holds our engine brace in place. Through this access hole, we're going to get that out first, and then we'll work on lowering the engine and getting the rest of the brace off. Just note, this bolt does have a sleeve on the other side of the brace that may fall down. You can take it off. You want to make sure it all goes back together the same way. All right, that's good for now. Now let's grab our T55 and then undo the 2 engine mount bolts. Again, this is a T55. There's one. Now let's head over to the passenger side. And then same thing, T55 on the other side. All right. Now with both of our T55s undone on either mount, we're going to go ahead and lower our engine at about 40mm at most. You are going to bottom out on the subframe brace, so you want to make sure you don't hit that if you're doing this at home and following along. That should be enough. Our next move is going to be to remove these 2 nuts and this bolt up here. That way we can remove this whole brace. Now, technically, you do not have to take off this whole thing. You can back up these nuts and the bolts just a bit so you can get some room. However, for sake of filming and giving you guys the best view possible, we're going to get rid of this whole brace. So let's do that next. These are same as the top bolt, 16mm. Just careful now as you put force on this, your whole engine's going to move. So here's that spacer I was talking about prior. You're going to want to make sure this all lines up when you put it back together. So it's going to be spacer, this brace, your main plates. There we have it. We have full access to our water pump and our thermostat. So let's get started on the thermostat and water pump removal. All right, we're going to start with the thermostat removal first. You're going to need a 10mm Torx to get these off, and 3. Our kit comes with new hardware, so don't worry about losing this. Now you're going to pull the thermostat off from the block. So you have your catch can underneath. So you can see, here's our old setup. You have your old gasket. You have your old thermostat. And the thermostat has its old gasket here as well. Make sure all that comes off. Now, before we continue any further, there was something I wanted to point out. In our new thermostat kit, you get this new sealing ring that sits inside the thermostat housing. Now, to be completely blunt, this is kind of a pain in the butt to swap out. You basically need a slide hammer of sorts to pull out the old one, and then you need to press your new one in. Typically, you can get away without replacing them, especially if the interior seal isn't damaged. The one on ours is in pretty good shape. Our new thermostat sits in nicely, so we're going to go ahead and continue without it. However, it does come with the kit. If you're feeling brave, you can go ahead and swap it out on your own. Before we install our new thermostat and gaskets, I'm going to take a Scotch-Brite pad and I'm just going to clean up these mating surfaces really quick, very lightly. I'm not trying to gouge it or anything, and then we'll put it back together. Take our new thermostat. Make sure your new gasket's on it. You're going to feel it slip into the sealing ring in here. Beautiful. I'm just clocking it the same way the old one came out. Take our new gasket, coat it in a little bit of coolant. Same thing, this one's preformed to where it's going to key into the housing. Now I'm just going to go ahead and rotate it back so it's facing the right direction. while grabbing onto the gasket and the thermostat at the same time. And I'm gently gonna put it back into place. I'm gonna take my new hardware and just get it started by hand. And now we're gonna tighten all three down. Again, this is an E10 torque socket. We're just gonna snug them all down by hand, and then we're gonna torque them down to 13 Newton meters, or 9.5 foot-pounds. Now I'm gonna take this bolt that we took at the beginning with the hose clamp, just feed it back in through this notched spot in the thermostat housing, and feed it in. With the bolt started by hand, I'm gonna go ahead and then tighten it down with my same wrench from earlier. This is again one of those multi-teeth 8mm wrenches, just snugged up. It's just an alignment bolt. If you're not able to thread it in, then that means that you need to loosen up your three E10s at the bottom and adjust the housing itself. All right, our thermostat is situated. Next move is going to be to replace our water pump. You may be able to hear this on camera, but the bearing is pretty wasted. Got a little bit of play in the shaft, so it's a good thing we're replacing this. Again, this is original, 64,000 miles. Same E10 torques. You're going to go ahead and remove the bolts on the surrounding area, and then this one specific bolt's going to be a different size, which I'll show you in a moment. And then this last bolt is going to be an E12. And just like with the thermostat housing, be prepared for some coolant to fall out. Still see it has the original plastic impeller or composite plastic, whatever you want to call it. And our old gasket is looking pretty smushed. Wow, that is basically a rubber band now. Let's get our Scotch-Brite pad, clean up the surface a little bit. We got our mating surface all cleaned up. Our new gasket is already pre-installed on the new water pump. You can see these come with a new metal impeller, a little bit more of an upgrade versus the plastic. Go ahead and just line it up and start our new hardware that comes with the kit. Just start it by hand. With that kind of lined up, I'm going to start by snugging down my E12 bolt first. This is the biggest one out of all of them. I'm going to grab my E10 and snug up the rest. Now these are all snugged down. Our E10s are all going to be torqued to 13 Newton meters, or 9.5 foot-pounds, just like the thermostat housing bolts were. I'm going to do them in a cross pattern. And then our E12 is going to be a little bit different. We're going to torque that one down to 23 Newton meters, or 17 foot-pounds, whichever you desire. New water pump pulley comes with new hardware as well. To tighten these down, you're going to need a T40. And we're going to torque them down to about 23 Newton meters. With that on, we're going to go ahead and put our belt on and try to use some of the friction from that to torque these down. Again, if you're going to be undoing the tensioner from here, it's a 30mm. I didn't have one in the shop today, so an adjustable will do the trick. And this is a T40, and it's going to be about 23 Newton meters. Next on our list, we're going to start putting up our engine brace hardware back in. One thing to note is this spacer does need to sit on the top left. So right now, when I put it in, everything's going to just kind of dangle around. You're going to have to fish it from up top and line it up with the hardware when you get to that point. For those of you following along at home that removed your engine brace like me, let's go ahead and put it back together. We got our first plate on. Next, we're going to take the brace itself and feed it up into place. Be mindful that your engine mounts studs go on each end of it. All right, something like that. Once we have our engine brace in like this, and on my side, you're going to know I only have one stud poking through. Our stud on the left came out with the nut, so typically you're going to have both studs peeking out right now. So it may look a little different for you. Before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and put our next plate on. This is the one that holds our exhaust. I'm just going to feed that bolt through and start it by hand. Leave everything loose. I'm going to start our nut. Same thing, leave it loose. Here's my stud that came out with my nut. So this is going to go back in as one. And next, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and raise the engine on my screw jack. I'm going to work on feeding this sleeve through while also feeding the bolt through and starting that by hand as well. I don't want this to cross thread inside of the block by accident, so let's get set up for that. So as I go up, I'm gonna make sure that both engine mounts are feeding through the brace just by feeling. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking another screw jack. I'm gonna lift up on the block a little bit to help level this out. And I'm doing this so I can get my spacer in with that top left bolt on the brace. So before I feed the bolt all the way through, I'm gonna insert my spacer. And then what I'm gonna do, most importantly, because this one has this funky spacer, I'm gonna make sure it starts threading in by hand first. I don't wanna have any stress on it. And now with that important one lined up, I'm just gonna bring this back down a little bit to make it easier to work on. And I'm gonna go ahead and snug up the rest of this hardware. All right. Now we're gonna torque these down to 48 foot-pounds. And now, once we jack up our motor, we're gonna go through our axis hole again and tighten up the top left one. I'm gonna start both of our T55s by hand. And I'm gonna do the same thing on the passenger side. I'm gonna snug them up with a ratchet. Again, these are gonna be a T55 socket. Just snug up the left side as well. Now we're gonna torque them down to 63 foot-pounds. Now we can head back up here and we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our air box, starting by hooking up our vacuum line and our electrical connector to our solenoid here. Just make sure your vacuum line is routed under the right side of the plug there. Then it can slip right back on while it's here, just like that. You're gonna feed your air box down. Again, you have two alignment tabs on the bottom. You saw our air filter replacement video that those key into the body of the car. At the same time, you're gonna pull back on the intake tube. And now it's just a matter of wrestling with the air box and getting that intake boot on. You might have to pop it out of the alignment holes first to get it in place. If you need to, you can loosen the clamp a little bit more just to get some more wiggle room out of the intake tube, so you can make sure it seats around the throttle body perfectly. Great. With the intake boot seated all around the throttle body, you'll be able to see that, well, you'll be able to see the outside flap that the hose clamp sits next to be kind of flush and flat like this. It's not going to be smushed or bent in. Same thing on the bottom half. You'll be able to feel it almost all the way around, and you'll also be able to see if the hose clamp is kind of squishing the neck of the boot on the bottom half. If it is, then it's probably not sitting flush. So just keep an eye on that before you tighten anything down. With that nice and tight, we can go ahead and replug in our mass airflow sensor. Now let's reinstall our muffler and our shields and wrap up this job. All right, my good people, at this point we are ready to reinstall our center section. Just side note, I went ahead and pressed these out with an air gun. As you saw earlier, they were corroded. Not necessarily a part of this DIY, pretty straightforward if you're replacing them. Otherwise, you should just be at the part where you're installing your exhaust. So without further ado, let's grab our center section and kind of get it up here where it's gonna go, something like that. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my straps and I'm gonna go ahead and get those situated around the body. Grab your hardware, get one side started if possible. And once you have one side started, we can do the other. And you wanna make sure this sleeve is in between the clamps. So you can see my first side doesn't have it, it's okay. I just needed it to get started on there. Here we go, again, it's stud, spacing sleeve, and then back into the hanger. So you want to position this kind of roughly what it used to be like. As you tighten them up, you can also see the old marks on the exhaust of where they used to sit. So I'm going to try to mimic that as best as I can, while also making sure that my flange holes bolt up and line up together. Okay, so I'm going to leave them just loose enough so I have a little bit of play. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and start with the left muffler and just position it over so that it goes into our new clamp. Something like that. And then I'm gonna grab my 13 on an impact and zap these down real quick. Just enough to hold everything. I'm not gonna tighten everything to the max until I have my flanges lined up as well. So let's head over to the other side and do the same thing. All right, so now everything's kind of loosely in place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start feeding my flange gaskets through in my hardware so that these can line up first. I'm going to start with the inside one, mainly due to the fact that that one does not have the bracket going around it. So I'll start with my inside one, and then we'll worry about the other two. Same thing like on the other side, I'm going to feed the one that doesn't have the bracket going through it first. Boom, baby. Now we'll start feeding the rest of our hardware through. Now let's head over to the passenger side and finish the rest of our hardware install. Taking a 13mm wrench and socket to tighten these up. Now we're going to tighten down these exhaust clamps. Again, these are 13mm nuts on the clamps. So the same thing on the other side. Now tighten down our straps around the muffler. Again, this is a 6mm hex. Beautiful. Now we can put our heat shield back on. And the heat shield is simply going to slide back over. I'm going to just make sure I key the ends into the outer heat shield as well. And again, those are 16mm bolts. I'm just going to snug them down pretty tight with the regular 3/8 ratchet. Now we can put our bumper cover back on. All right, our bumper cover. Just be careful of the sides of the car. You don't want to scratch them as you feed this on. Something like that. We'll work on the passenger side first and get it clipped in. I'm just going to pop it in just like that. Make sure your bolt holes line up. Make sure this bottom end makes its way back in. Let's do the same thing on the other side. And make sure this clips in, just like that. You make sure your bottom goes in. This will be secured with the hardware once we go up. Next, we're going to install our 4 T30 screws up top. Next, you got this plastic expanding rivet that goes in the corner here. And that is the same, a T30. Doesn't have to be very tight. So the same thing on the passenger side now. With that, we can go ahead and reinstall our taillights while we have the car at eye level. You have on the outside of the taillight one plastic hook, if you will, that keys in to the grommet right here. You want to make sure that goes in. And while you do that, you want to make sure your inner hardware also lines up. And these are T25. Again, I'm just going to use my old markings from the hardware locations to line up the taillight how it was. Beautiful. Let's do the same thing on the other side. And go ahead and plug in my electrical connector. Okay. And I'm going to make sure it keys in at the inside over there. While also finding its way over here. And again, a T25 for this side, using the old alignment marks. And you can always go back and fine tune this if you don't like how it's sitting. But for now, this works for us. And now let's head underneath and put the last couple fasteners in. Next, we're going to do the 2 T30s that are in the wheel well. While making sure that our bumper is flush on the body. Let's do the same thing on the passenger side now. And same thing, T30 on this side, while I'm making sure that my bumper and fender line are flush. Beautiful. And now we have 6 fasteners left alongside the bottom of the bumper. Boom, baby. All right, with everything buttoned up now, the next thing to do is bleed and fill our coolant system. So to do that, we're going to do 2 things. One, we have a 10mm nut that holds this tank in place. The reason I'm going to undo that is to get the tank out a little bit. For the specific bleeder that we're using, I need all the room I can to work with, so let me do that first. There's different kinds of bleeders out there, vacuum bleeders. This is the one we have in the shop today. While it doesn't have the best room to work with in here, it does do the job. You want to hook this up to your air line. Make sure your valve is closed on the tool. And then to make sure you have a good seal on here, what you can do is you can start pressing on the silver button here to start creating a suction. So far it seems to be holding, so what I'm going to do is, in case we pull up any coolant from the system that may have remained, I'm going to wrap this towel just around the nozzle here where the air exits, just to keep overspray down to a minimum. You want to get it as close as possible to 25 on the gauge. We're going to let it sit for a minute, make sure it doesn't drop. If it starts dropping, that means we have a leak somewhere. But if it holds, then that means our system is tight. Then we can show you how to prime the line with coolant and then fill the system up. It's been about a minute or two. Our system's holding. I got it as close to 25 as possible.
To the left of me, you'll see I have a big blue bucket. I have 2 gallons of concentrated genuine Porsche coolant in there, as well as 2 gallons of distilled water, giving me a perfect 50-50 blend. I'll go ahead and stir it up. What you want to do is you want to make sure this end of the fill tube is always at the very bottom of the bucket. The second you suck air in, the whole thing is obsolete. So I'm going to go ahead and keep one hand on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my valve up here, and I'm just going to let the whole line fill up with coolant and then shut it off as soon as that happens. All right. Now, even though that wasn't a lot, there's still some air that got back in the system with just that little bit of space in between the lines. So for a second or two, we're just going to evacuate it. And now comes the fun part. I'm going to hold the end of my hose in my bucket with one hand, release the valve with the other, and just let the system do its thing until it's completely full. All right, my good people, at this point, the system's pretty much stopped consuming coolant, and then I should be able to just open up the valve and pull up on this tool. Beautiful. And from there, right now, it is currently at the minimum on the tank. Once we run it a little bit, we'll have this bleeder valve open, as mentioned earlier, just to help burp any little bit of cavities that may be trapped with air in there still. We'll put our cap back on in the meantime, slide our tank all the way back in, put our 10mm nut back.
And there you have it, my good people, another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward job, however, a bit daunting at first. Again, a couple ways to go at it. You don't necessarily have to remove the whole brace like we did. However, for today's purpose of filming, it was a lot easier to do so. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.